Now I'm going to reintroduce part of, use some of this from Dr. Stedman's bio. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Brown Bag today. Dr. Kyle Stedman is Associate Professor of English at Rockford University, where he directs the Writing Center and the New Writing Across the Curriculum initiative. He teaches first-year rhetoric, professional writing, creative nonfiction, and the rhetoric of sound. His publications include his Born Digital co-edited collection, Sound Writing Pedagogies, and the personal audio essay, Pincushion. And he's currently co-writing a textbook on teaching with recorded sound in writing and rhetoric classroom. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kyle Stedman.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming. Let me start with three quick little warnings and prep things. One, this is very early stage thinking. I almost hesitate to call it research. It's just kind of me thinking out loud. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A, hopefully to actually hear some of your real thoughts on how some of this can cohere. Two, I am going to play some audio throughout. Let me play a little sound here to give you a sense of how loud it might be, but you might want to keep your hand on your speakers to get a sense of like, do I need to turn it up or turn it down to be able to hear what I'm doing? So here's your sample audio. Hopefully you heard wind chimes, I think. It's funny that I like the sound of wind chimes a lot digitally, but I don't like them in person because I feel like they won't ever stop. The third thing I want to share is you see there's a link here to access this entire slideshow later. So throughout there's links to citations, places where you can hear some of the things that I'm going to share for you here. So I'll put that link up again at the end. So if you're like, oh yeah, I want to look some of that up. Well, let me dive in and give just a really quick overview of where I situate myself in English studies. People who are in English studies might disagree with kind of this really quick overview, but if we say that there's like an umbrella, and underneath that umbrella, there's these three main sections of kind of how people who study English are broken down. If we had like a 1 minute conversation, I would kind of say, oh yeah, I'm in the rhetoric and composition side. I don't study Shakespeare. I don't necessarily teach you how to write fiction or poetry.
What do you say?
Oh, if we could mute people, that'd be awesome. I'm in the side where we study rhetoric, the study of communication, how to communicate, and also how to teach people to communicate. But if we met for like 5 minutes, if we had a couple more minutes, I would say, well, there's actually like another smaller umbrella under that, and there's all kinds of things, that's only a few of them, to show how people study the theories of communication and how to teach communication. And if we had like a half hour, I'd say, well, actually, I might say that under multimodal rhetoric, communicating beyond just words, communicating with images and senses and all these other things, I would say, well, under that, I would place myself, my scholarship, and most of my teaching in the sonic rhetoric field. I'm really interested in how sound communicates. What is sound, spoken and music? How do all those things give us different ways to communicate beyond just what we can write, beyond just what we could put in an image or a poster? And in some ways, what this presentation is about is how occasionally, every 3 semesters, I do teach creative writing at Rockford University, especially creative nonfiction. That's where you're writing personal essays or memoirs about yourself and about your own life. So in some ways, this presentation is me saying, how could I connect those two interests of mine, which is something that I would say not a lot, and maybe not even enough people in English studies do. So I want to start with 2 example stories here. Now there's a literary magazine called Streetlight Magazine. And if you have fiction, poetry, creative nonfiction that you want to publish, you can send them a print version, the words of what you want to print. And if they publish it, occasionally they have a podcast, and occasionally they'll have a professional actor, including Jennifer Sims here, read your writing for their podcast. You don't read it yourself. And what's interesting to me is that even if it's about you, even if it's like a very personal story about your own life growing up, you're still not the one who reads it. And of course, there's benefits to that, right? We get a professional. So here's what Jennifer Sims sounds like reading this piece.
Father's Tears by Jean-Auguste Gravel. Read for you by Jennifer Sims. I've never seen my father cry. This is surprising because he's not one of those boys don't cry sorts and never scolded us for tears.
So like I said, you can click that link if you go back to this later and actually listen to that whole piece. You can read the whole piece. And of course, when everything's green on the side, that's a transcript of what you're about to hear. So let's contrast this Streetlight magazine with a second literary magazine. This one's called The Drum. Now, The Drum is different. The Drum isn't like a written literary magazine that also has a podcast. The Drum is all audio. It's a place that only publishes audio, creative nonfiction, fiction, and poetry. And at The Drum, you still submit a printed work. You still submit something in writing, and if they accept it, they say, "Oh, we like it. Would you like to read this now?" Now, you can ask them to read it for you. You can say, "I really don't have a good mic. This is not my forte." But I wasn't actually able to find anyone who submitted memoirs, stories about their own lives, that they didn't read themselves. In other words, I'm going to play you a piece of Janice Ray, and she's reading her own work here. So let's contrast that with what we just heard at Streetlight.
We waited until school was out to tell our little girl. When she heard the news, she put her head on my shoulder and wept like I have never seen her weep. She wept fully, cleanly, profoundly. She was a child who had a lot of grief before she came to live with us, and her response to her past grief was anger. But now she wept.
So I can imagine people preferring this more than Streetlight, the same way I can imagine people preferring Streetlight over The Drum. When I hear Ray reading those words, I know that they're her words, that they're her story. They're in some intimate way are tied to her experience of life. So here's why I'm telling you these two stories. I found myself freaking out once and saying, where can I publish my own audio memoir work? The reason for this is because I had a piece I'd been working on called Pincushion. And Pincushion was a piece that I had already produced. I had already read it myself, which in some ways makes it instantly not applicable to either place, because both of these publications are places where I have to send them the print version. You could say the transcript, or the written version of it first. And in this time when I was trying to publish Pincushion, I didn't want to do that. The reason I didn't want to is because I had composed it in and as audio. And you say, well, what does that mean? Well, part of what that means is that I had already layered in some sound effects. I had layered in some music. And honestly, I had read it the way that I particularly wanted to. I had read it and edited it in a way that I thought, yes, this is the full, complete package. This is the experience of my story that I'd like to share. It's a story about me sticking a pin through my friend's class photo in 4th grade and pulling the fire alarm in 5th grade. Long story. So what this did for me is it led me to 3 big questions that really I'm going to dig into a little bit here today, and hopefully you can help me with. The first one, I know how this sounds, but I like my version. Don't get me wrong, I like the other stuff, but I'm kind of like, what is it in my heart that wants to hear people's stories in audio with the completeness of all the extra things that they may or may not choose to add? Related to that is, where can I go to hear that, and where can I go to publish that kind of work? If I created an audio piece, will anyone take that? Can I submit to you an audio file instead of just the written form? I don't know. The third part is, of course, why does this seem so rare? So this is just kind of what I'm fiddling around with, what I've been playing around with. So I do want to answer those, but can we take a quick super brief overview of what I mean when I'm going to talk about memoir throughout here. So I've got 5 quotes. Why don't I be quiet and take a drink of water while you read those really quickly? What you can see in these 3 quotes on the left, and again, if you click any of those later, they'll take you to Google Books to tell you kind of where they came from. What you see on the left is that it's kind of Memoir 101. It's kind of the first day's lesson when I teach creative writing, when I teach creative nonfiction. It's the idea that this is not going to be a class, or there's not going to be a genre that's telling every single thing about your life. It's not a biography. It's not a bulleted list. It's not a Wikipedia article. Instead, when I talk about memoir, I really mean that it's crafted. It's really been constructed in the way that Zinsser says there. It's saying I have a particular message that I want to resonate with you through the parts of my story that I'm choosing to tell. And when you look at these 2 quotes on the right, you see a couple of lines perhaps that well, you can see how people often talk about good memoir as having a sort of voice. Now that's talking about written memoir, right? When it's written on the page. But as someone who studies sound, as a sound scholar, I'm very kind of perk up when I see that. I'm like, wait a minute, this reminds me of the kind of ways we talk about sound. How part of the power of an audio essay, say, is that it's going straight to your ears. It's embodied and connecting with you in ways that that written words on the page don't always do. So of course, as I started thinking about this, and I started thinking, well, where do people access sound these days? Well, of course, there's a million ways, but of course, a huge one is through podcasts. I'm not going to get into the numbers about how podcasts are growing, how big they are, how many people do listen to podcasts, how people access them. There are articles out on that. If you need a definition, feel free to, like, on your phone, kind of Google what in the world is a podcast. Anyway, I'm not going to do that today. But so that kind of led me to say, well, specifically, are there podcasts that are memoir based? And I know if you are a podcast listener, what you might be thinking. You're sitting there on Zoom and you're like, but Kyle, there's so much personal stuff in podcasts. In other words, but Kyle, part of what makes some of the shows I love work is that I'm hearing the personal. There are producers who are sharing parts of their lives, and they're interviewing people who are sharing parts of their lives. And that's part of what has led to the podcast boom and a lot of the creative radio journalism boom. And I'm not going to disagree with you. I agree with that. I love all of these shows and more, specifically when they include the personal. But to me, they feel different than memoir. They feel different than someone who has said, I've gone over and over and over crafting this piece of my life into the exact package that I want you to have. So I've come up with 3 criteria that I don't even know if this is possible, but I've come up with 3 criteria of stuff that I kind of want to hear, and I kind of want to listen, and I kind of want to make and submit to places. One, of course, is that I want personal stories about real lives. But of course, I also, as you can hear me saying, I want crafted stuff. I don't want necessarily someone in an interview saying, hey, let me just kind of tell you about my life. That's great. I love that stuff, but I'm especially interested in someone who has honed it and sharpened it. To me, that would actually exclude interviews. It would also exclude a show like the Moth Radio Hour. Maybe you hear that on NPR sometimes, where someone practices a story and they craft a story with a producer, and then they get up on stage in front of a live person. But in that, even the everyday words, the actual words they're using are somewhat off the cuff, right? It's the way I'm talking to you now. I planned this talk, but I don't know every single word that I've come up with. It's not crafted in the way that every single word is crafted in a printed memoir. The third thing that I'm kind of perhaps unrealistically looking for is I love the idea of a self-designed memoir. In other words, where the person who's sharing their story is also making all of the choices about which take to include, how loud to speak, how to speak, what music to include, what effects to include. I'm thinking of me. I'm inspired by my own pincushion piece, but I'm like, where's that stuff? Okay, so let's look at some examples, right? I've got 3 here that I think do. Oh yeah, skip that. So there's a podcast called Millennial. It's produced and created by Megan Tan. And let me play 2 clips from Millennial. I'll start with this one here.
And before I knew it, I had become what the restaurant calls a brunchy.
Let's go, let's go.
What do you guys think? Slow day? Busy day?
Good morning, Local 188. This is Megan. Corner.
Corner.
Corner. How many? Can I get you guys something to drink besides water? Coffee? Cappuccino? Orange juice.
I love when you listen to a clip a million times and you still like it every time, right? Orange juice. I'm waiting for that. You might hear that and you might say, Kyle, this doesn't sound like what you were talking about at all. That's documentary tape. That's her being a journalist, walking around with a recorder while she's working as a brunchy. I think it'll make more sense when you hear the next clip. What I'm interested here is that Tan, as you can see, she's cutting the own tape. She's choosing how to construct these stories from her own life, not someone else's life. And then the next part, you'll hear she adds some music that she chose. And you hear that she's always contrasting her documentary tape with her narration tape, which to me is really important. And it's something that memoir podcasts could add to memoirs. In other words, if I'm writing a story of my life, I don't really have like notes necessarily on everything that I said in that difficult conversation with my family or something. But if you're creating audio and you know that you're creating it and you've got that tape recorder out the whole time, maybe maybe you can use that in a kind of newer, interesting, more complicated way. So here's clip 2 from the same show, same episode. Show you what I'm talking about.
I do have a hard time with this, and it repeatedly comes up after dinner when it's just Ben and I sitting around the kitchen table.
I know you still have dark times now, and you wish that you were more professionally, successful.
Yeah. I don't know if it's still just like, because like you see yourself as having a lot of potential, and you just want like other people to see you as having lots of potential, so that they'll like get you out of being a waitress, or
I'm gonna cut her short, which almost feels rude when she's sharing this part of her life. But do you see what I mean? There's tape from her life that she's choosing to craft in a way to share it with us across this whole serialized podcast show. A couple more examples. There's a show called Not by Accident. It's a story of a woman who was artificially inseminated, and she's telling the story to her child, essentially, to say, you were not by accident. I had you on purpose. And in the first episode, she shares a tape of her conversation with her mom that I'm not going to play for you. And she's laughing with her mom when she finds out that she is pregnant, just like she wanted to be. And she tells her mom this funny story of sitting in public and thinking, did my egg just drop? I think I could tell the moment when you could maybe officially say that, yes, I am indeed pregnant. So let me play this. And this time you can see that my bullets over here. Listen to how she shares her story in a way that adds something that you might not be able to do as easily in just words on the page.
It actually felt more profound than funny when it happened. There was a sound too, but only inside me. Something like, was that it? A warm sensation. Pop. Flutter. But I can't tell people about the sound. I thought it's so cheesy. Things like that don't happen in real life. Can you really be so hyper-aware of these tiny moments in your life where everything changes? No, I'm just a romantic. My life is a romantic comedy about a single woman and an insemination. But I'll never forget that moment.
So I don't know exactly how Sophie Harper recorded this. My sense is that she wrote it, that she wrote on words and crafted these words to be just right, and then she was reading from a script, reading well and performing from a script. But I think, again, this fits my criteria, something that was crafted. Because I'm getting low on time, I am going to play you this clip. I think by now you'll know what to listen for without me kind of talking over it. This is from a podcast called How to Be a Girl, about a woman raising her transgender daughter. Oops, and I missed the click. Here it is.
My daughter just started kindergarten. I told the staff at her school that she was transgender, but we didn't tell the other parents. This strategy really ticked off some of the moms in preschool last year. When they found out that one of the girls at school had a penis, they kind of freaked out. Penis. They said they had a right to know. Penis. At first I thought this was reasonable of them, to insist on knowing what's in my kids' pants or skirts. But not anymore.
Okay, please unrecord the penis.
What this one adds to the previous conversation is this playing with stereo. I don't know if any of you have headphones on right now. When the child says penis, it actually is going back and forth. Again, something that you can do with, we could say, the affordances of sound in a way that is harder in other mediums. By the way, I hope it doesn't sound like I'm dissing on written words or written memoir. I love and support all of that. I'm just talking about something different too. So partly though, as I started looking for those examples and started looking for examples of podcasts that I would call memoirs in my way, I kept coming across other things that I was like, I love this and I love it in a similar way. So maybe my criteria aren't that useful. So let me play you two examples that I think complicate my criteria, that are examples that kind of speak back to me and say, well, Kyle, do you really need this list of 3 things that you have? So here's an example from a podcast called Bodies from KCRW. It's a great show where the producer, Allison Behringer, as far as I can tell, I haven't looked this up yet, it seems to me that Allison goes out and collects the stories from people. The first one's actually about her life. I think the first episode would count as a memoir. But the other episodes, it sounds like she gets a long interview, and then she takes that interview tape and she edits it up and does all the things that the previous ones did, adding some music, add some effects, thinks about the timing in a powerful way. So this one fit my criteria because in this example, it's a woman named Kalalea who's struggled with her periods, with bleeding throughout her whole life, and she's telling that story. But it's Behringer who I think is behind the scenes producing this quote. I don't know. Does this count as memoir? Could it? Do we need a new category? I don't know. Let's hear it and find out.
If my period came on a Friday and I had plans on Saturday, I might cancel them. If I had on white sheets on my bed, I might remove those sheets, put on like my older sheets. You know, your friends can say, I'm sorry, let me know if you need anything. But you are the one laid on top of red towels in the dark and just saying, just get to day 3 and all this will be over. And then you'll have another 28 days. Another 28 days. Another 28
So it's that last part that gets me, right? The tinny voice, the just get to day 3, and an audio way to hear a quote, an audio way to separate narration from previous, even though it was Behringer, I think, who did that. One more complication. Remember how I was kind of dissing on interviews, but not dissing on interviews. Remember how I was saying interviews don't count for me. And yet there's a writer whose memoir in a book form I read, maybe not memoir, a collection of essays by Esme Wang about struggling with schizoaffective disorder and a lot of related illnesses. And then I heard an interview of her on the Unfictional podcast. And I thought, oh, great, this will be for me, the emotional, powerful moments were in the book. And then I'll hear this kind of separated, unemotional, just kind of like the story of behind the scenes, like the DVD extras in the interview on the podcast. That's what I expected. So I didn't expect to find myself kind of actually feeling moved, actually feeling more connected when I heard Esme speak on the interview. And part of me is like, would this have affected me the same way if I hadn't read the book? Was it because it was like a fleshing out or embodying of something that I had already read in only written form? I don't know, but here's part, of course, I can't give you the whole thing, but here's a little clip of what was working for me.
I still live with schizoaffective disorder, so I guess it might not be over. There are things that happen as a result of terrible things that aren't terrible. Becoming a little bit more compassionate was one of the things that happened for me. You never know what is going on with anybody else. Gratitude for being alive, feeling alive, is something that I never want to lose.
Maybe I'm just someone who loves, quote, quiet, brooding, rhythmic electronic music. I don't know. That does so much for me. Okay, so we're wrapping up, but where does this leave me? What do I do with all of these kind of, I don't know, I like this, I don't like this sort of things? The first one is obviously, are my criteria really useful? I'm making them up, so why not change them if they're not working for me? It's an interesting theme too. My second bullet there is that not on purpose was it that so many of the examples I displayed had something to do with bodies, often with bodies not working in the way that we necessarily expect. I'm not sure how much of that was just me. How much of that is that the places that I went to look? How much of it is there possibly something, I'm just playing around here, is there possibly something about hearing someone's story in your ears, hearing someone's story in your headphones, that leads to an intimacy of a kind that leads people to want to share, or to be especially appropriate to share stories about bodies in that way. We're hearing it with different parts of our body, so the body seems like a ripe or natural topic for conversation. I know there is some work on this. I know there's an essay about sonic intimacy that I sometimes assign my students, but I'm not really up on all of that work. So maybe if some of you could say, wait, Kyle, make sure you read this, maybe that would kind of help me develop that suspicion a little more. But that's all it is, a suspicion. Possibly part of the problem here, you can see my third bullet, is that maybe I'm just not being fair. Part of what I'm saying I want from people are people who have the same overlapping skill set that I happen to have. Can I say that without sounding braggy or something? I want people to be amazing writers. I want them to be able to take that amazing writing and read it well, which we all know isn't always the case. I want them to read it well and then also produce it well, and then also have a way to get it to me, to my phone, to my podcast app. Maybe I'm just need to lower my expectations. I don't know. Fourth, I wonder if copyright fears is related here. There are creative nonfiction podcasts out there. And generally the ones that I found are not examples of people saying, hey, today, here's someone who will read or produce their memoir for you. Instead, it tends to be interviews with authors. Again, interviews are great, but when I only have a limited amount of time that I want to listen to something while I'm doing the dishes, while I'm driving to work, in those in-between times, often I don't want the 60-minute interview. I want the 15-minute condensed, perfect crafted piece of work. So maybe there's something where people are like, well, I don't exactly own the rights to this, or I shared the rights when I published it with a journal, or maybe we're scared of getting people on here and reading their own thing, because then we're gonna have to figure out who has what rights. For instance, the CNF podcast, the Creative Nonfiction podcast, they, as far as I could ever find, I could only find 2 episodes where there was any actual creative nonfiction on the show. And they were both episodes where the host was reading his own previously published work. He never asked people to get on the show and read their own work. I wonder if there's something about permissions. Not sure, just a guess. So if you're interested in hearing any of my stuff, these are just a few audio publications of my own. Pincushion did get published in Memoir magazine. It is an outlier. It's the only thing like it on that site, but they were also enough to publish it. But it is online. You can hear it and you can read the transcript as well. There are links to all that on this site if you look for this later. So I'm going to be quiet and let's have some conversation. We've got at least 20 minutes.
Not a question, but can you please, do you hear me by the way?
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, can you please post a link to the chat screen so that we can take a look at that? It can't be like clickable here.
Oh yeah.
Let me
actually like get out of the screen share, because I don't think you need that anymore, and I'll put it in here while you all are trying to figure out what you want to tell me or ask me. So Marilén, are there rules for Q&A, or is it just whoever's got a question, just dive in?
Sorry, I'm unmuting myself. There are no rules except, yeah, just those who have questions. And as Kyle said, we have just under 20 minutes.
Well, I just want to say there's a source. I mean, it's a slightly different, Kyle, from what you were saying, but you probably know about it. But the Missouri Review, it's only once a year, but they have the Miller Audio Prize. It's a contest, and they have various categories. I mean, one of them is poetry, but one of them is nonfiction prose. There's another category, and I can't remember right now. But anyway, that's just kind of a nice source. Again, you're probably aware of it, but if anybody wants to investigate that and submitting to that, it's kind of an interesting thing.
And thanks for saying that, Susan. Hi, by the way. I miss you. I actually, where Pincushion came from was I made it for that prize. I designed it for the Miller Audio Prize. I didn't win. And then I've got this thing and I'm like, I really worked hard on this. I'm proud of it. Yeah, what can I do? And I felt like I kept hitting wall after wall after wall. But thank you. Yeah.
Well, I submitted a poem for that too, and I didn't win. But I did learn about audacity and other kinds of things, and that was very interesting.
Oh,
it's
fun.
a very interesting experience. And the nice thing about it is they don't expect you to be as, they don't expect you to be, it's a good way to get your feet wet, in other words, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
Susan, Orhan had written in the chat and asked if you could write that reference into the chat, what you just mentioned.
Sure.
That'd be great. Thank you. Tommy, go ahead.
Oh.
And Stephanie.
Maybe Ryan first. Did he go?
Sorry about that. I didn't mean to intrude.
You're good.
I was wondering what audience would be specific to these I guess, pseudo podcasts. would there be, like, because my immediate thought was, like, not everybody has access to different technologies to attribute audio or attribute even video to their personal narratives, which is why I guess print is so widely accessible. And having edited or been an editor to a literary magazine prior to this, I'm thinking, would we get the like world perspectives that other literary magazines get from an audio style?
I love that question about would we lose perspectives. I guess if I were starting a new journal, if I was starting the Kyle Stedman Literary Journal or podcast with exactly the criteria that I want, I would have to work that in, right? I would have to really emphasize that I want to hear multilingual voices, that I want to hear your accent, that I want to hear the sounds from your places. But besides that, I guess I'm not sure. I think there is a higher curve here. There is more being asked from this kind of adding all these extra skills onto it. So your first question was what audience would be going for? Maybe there isn't one out there. I'm not really sure yet. It's not a very good answer, but that's I wrote it down to think about.
We had Stephanie and Donna. And I think you're on mute, Stephanie.
There you go. Thank you, Kyle, and good to see you and others. Two reactions, both to points that you anticipated in your summing up. One relates to the subject. I noticed too that the subjects were all physical and very intimate. Even the mental health, if our brain is part of our bodies. And it occurred to me to ask whether the topic was also a criterion and whether the topic needed to be that personal. Did one do this with in a conversation about the election? Or does it need to be something visceral or corporeal? And then the second reaction was to your last point about the multitudinous skills that you bring to this project and whether that was fair and et cetera. What your project reminds me of is theater. In theater production, movie production, you've got expertises that are assigned to these aspects of the production that work in collaboration. And now that's being transferred to considerable levels of skill, maybe sub-professional, but still considerable levels of skill that have been isolated, that have been segregated, but come together for production, but they are honed separately. Do you think of what you're doing as a play, as a work of theater? So, reaction.
I love where you're going. Obviously, there is a rich history of radio theater, of people using audio. There's actually some interesting work in rhetoric where people have gone back and looked at ways that people have used radio theater in the context of a rhetoric class. Asked students to write something and then thought, okay, how can I give my audience the effect and the experience I want them to have by only listening alone, right? By adding that constraint. So I'm intrigued by it. When it comes to the different expertises, I feel both ways. I don't in any way want to suggest that if someone has the budget and the team to split up different parts of an audio production that they shouldn't, right? If you have someone who has the mics and can help you set them up and help you produce and help you record and even help you edit and get it out there, I think that's awesome. But I think one of the exciting things about podcasts that I didn't really get a chance to mention is how it does open the doors for people without all of that, how you can I can teach students to use Audacity, the program that Susan mentioned earlier, a free open access audio editor that anyone with a computer or access to a computer can start learning how to cut up and edit audio, whether it's talking or music or anything else. So part of me is excited by the you can all do it, and part of me is excited by the amateurishness of it. You know, by being a pro-am, by being like an amateur who still is leaning towards some aspects of professionalism. But it doesn't really answer. Okay.
Go ahead, Donna.
My question is very similar to Stephanie's. Now, it's very easy to do video nowadays, but do you think some of these stories are more powerful because it is audio only? I mean, we have to think of it in our mind, just like old-fashioned radio. So do you just follow audio, or do you also look at video stories, video narratives?
I don't personally, because there's so much that I haven't read or studied even in the sound area, but I know that there are people in my field who dip a little bit more towards video, or will kind of see themselves as studying. Remember, under that umbrella of multimodal rhetoric, people will study various modes of communicating. I do think there's something different, right? And I'm trying really hard to not ever say better, but there is something different about seeing a play versus hearing an audio play versus reading the text of the play. And those are all good, and those are all exciting. I almost feel like I'm kind of saying, don't forget the sound side, people. Don't forget the different ways we could theorize and understand the experience of sound alone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us and share your opinions on podcasts, memoir-based podcasts. While like looking throughout the world of podcasting, I've noticed that a lot of the platforms like Apple Podcasts and iTunes and Spotify put them into categories. And I was wondering what your take, like, should memoir-based podcast be its own category, or do you think that it should be placed under like this subcategory of like documentary, or what's your take on it? Where do you think it would fall under that umbrella?
That's a great question that's hard to answer, because I think people get to podcasts in so many different ways. And that's kind of exciting thing about them, right? Is that, yes, a lot of people are using Apple Podcasts, but Spotify is trying to get in on that. And some people will say, no, I go to Stitcher. I have an app called Podcast Addict that I use. So personally, when I find a new podcast, I almost always get it as a recommendation. I see someone on Twitter mention it, or if someone tells me, and I almost never find myself browsing the categories. But again, that's just me. That has nothing to do with what other people are doing. So part of me would want to learn more about, how important is the categorization for people. It'd be awesome if a podcast could be in multiple categories, right? It's partly this, partly this, partly that. I'm not sure if iTunes does that, or if Apple Podcast does that or not. But ultimately, I think for me, the experience that I'm talking about, I keep using kind of these vague, feely type words, because that's what it is. That's where the power comes from for me. To me, the experience is most like creative writing. It's the creative part of the creative nonfiction that really gets me. Yes, narrative journalism and things like that often kind of dip into that sort of power, but it's that feeling when you finish a wonderful book, whether it was fiction or nonfiction, and you're kind of have that like wonder and sadness that you feel like that was something that I just experienced. That's the feeling that I want. And to me, that feels and is more like a creative writing category. I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, actually.
Yeah.
If no one else does. My question is about process. So you had said that you're looking for things that are crafted. Right? And then on the one hand, you had the Moth Radio Hour as sort of a rehearsed but still oral format the whole time. And on the other hand, something like, I don't remember what it was, but it made me, the first clip you showed us reminded me of the New York Times Modern Love, right? It's a written essay that's read by someone else, right? So on those being two extremes, somewhere in the middle, I think is where you locate crafted. But it seems to me difficult to separate crafted from the written part and the oral part. Like there is writing, I think, involved in crafting the podcasts that you're talking about and that you want to hear more of. And at the same time, like when I do a presentation, a conference presentation, maybe I'll publish it one day and I should, but it's a different thing. And when I write for a presentation, even at a conference, I write differently because I'm going to be speaking it. I think that in some ways, like you're pointing to a different kind of writing.
Yeah.
That I think is a valuable part of the practice of crafting something of this nature. That it's still writing, but it's a very particularly oral kind of writing, which I love. But
yes, and in some ways, attending to that process is a real passion of mine, and sharing that process and helping people understand all the various ways that people can achieve the various kinds of effects they want to have in different contexts. I didn't go into this, but that pincushion piece that I started with, it did start as a written piece. I wrote a draft that was about twice as long as what eventually happened, what eventually came out. And I saw the call for the Miller Audio Prize that Susan mentioned. And I was like, oh, I like to submit something to this every year when I can. I don't have time to come up with a whole new story. What do I have? And I was like, I got this draft of an essay, and I started reading it, and it was unreadable, you know? And sure, it was just a draft, but it was long. It went on. At one point, I used bullet points. I was being creative visually. It just didn't make sense. So it was a complete rewrite from the ground up, in sense of things got cut out, things got added, and every single sentence was recrafted out loud with me saying it out loud. No, saying it out. No, saying it. And you know, all of that is part of that. And I would love for us as teachers of any kind of writing to be helping draw attention to what are the various ways that stuff happens. I mentioned at the very beginning, your bio mentioned that I'm working on a textbook with my friend Tanya Rodrigue, works at Salem State University. And what we found ourselves doing, this wasn't part of our original pitch to the publisher, but we found ourselves writing long, lengthy process pieces about how we composed two stories, audio stories I published and two audio stories she published. And they're so different. Everyone, even among ourselves, are different, and hers are so different. But we find ourselves saying, to tell you how can you make something like this, we feel like we have to invite you into it because there's so much behind the scenes. So thanks for putting your finger on that. That's if someone had said, what's the question that I hope I'll get asked, I would have like thrown you that one.
Well, it's exciting. It's a really exciting process that you're talking about. So, and it's wonderful to hear that you're doing all of this work, and we're excited to hear about it. We have time for one more question. Anyone? Does anyone want to ask a question who's accidentally on mute, maybe?
Oops, sorry. I just have a comment really, and that is that, at least in my experience, and I don't know if it's because of social distancing and COVID, but there seems to be more and more interest in the audio outlets for creative writing. I haven't done it, but I know, for instance, there is even something for poetry where you leave a phone message, you read your poem over the phone, and you know, to this literary magazine, and they use it that way. So I think it's very exciting because, you know, just going back in history, of course, the literary arts, telling stories in whatever form, you know, were audio. People spoke to each other, and I think that there's something wonderful about having that again. So thank you, Kyle.
Thank you for saying that. And there is a part of me that, one reason I put that umbrella of English studies at the beginning, I think I did put that partly when I talk creative writing and when I do creative writing, I feel out of my element. And I know some of it is just like beginner's fear, and I know I could just dive in and do it.
We all feel that way.
Of course. But there's a sense of where it's like, have I ever gone to AWP and like talked to people there about audio? Well, no, not yet. But one day I'm like, maybe I want to start moving more in that direction.
I think you should. Yeah, I think you definitely should.
Yeah, thanks.
So are you going to conduct a workshop on this that we can all attend?
I don't know. If you want, I will. Sure.
That'd be great.
Marilén, that might be another brown bag seminar.
It could be. We don't have the schedule set for next semester. We have a couple of people tentatively signed up. So if anyone here is interested, whether near or far, I know that there are lots of students here from American University. Welcome. It's great to see you all. And thanks for joining us. The link, hopefully you have it. I put it at the beginning of the in the chat right at the top for our next brown bag. Kyle, thank you so very much. Everyone, thank you so very much for being here. The questions were wonderful. It's a delightful presentation to have in the middle of a day. And especially the distancing, I think it brought us closer to ourselves and closer to each other. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kyle. That was great.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kyle. I learned a lot.
Thanks, Kyle.
That was fun.
This makes me want to hug everyone.
I know.
Kyle, I'm really serious.